The thing that I've been obsessing about for years and years is what makes cities walkable. And, this is sort of two images of places in cities. And, sort of intuitively, we can look at these things and say, we like the place on the left a whole lot more than the place on the right. And, there's trees, there's these nice stoops, there's, people standing in the street taking pictures, as opposed to this giant concrete thing. But quantitatively, what does this look like? How much more walkable is this place on the left than the place on the right? And how much more is it walkable based on something that it is doing itself versus the context that it's in? So these are the things that I've been grappling with and trying to figure out. The first place that I look to try to understand this stuff is the U.S. Census. This image looks just like kind of a blob, but this is from data from the 2000 census, where the long form had a question on it that was basically, where do you work? How do you get there? How long does it take to get you there? And this in particular is where people in New York who say that they walk to work. The purple is where they work. The green is where they live. And the sort of darker areas are where people both work and live. And this is extremely vague. You can see that there's kind of this blob in Midtown Manhattan, and another sort of darker blob to the right of that, where apparently there's both residential and commercial. But it really tells you very little about any individual street. And partly this is just because of the nature of the census. They're only asking a fraction of the people. And they're very careful about trying not to be too revealing about any individual. It's only aggregate stuff. But anyway, this is from the Census Transportation Planning Package, which is this thing you can download that's basically just a giant table of, places that people work versus places that they live. It's meant as public data, meant to be used for this kind of thing. But unfortunately doesn't give you a very clear picture. And so in the absence of a really clear picture, the next thing that I started doing was basically carrying a GPS around with me everywhere, and recording it. And in the thought that if I go to enough different places and I write down what I feel about these places and what they're doing to me, to my mental state, that maybe I can figure it out from that. So I spent 200 miles or so of walking around San Francisco trying to do this, and got to see a fair amount of places, but I don't think it really gave me any more systematic understanding of how this stuff works. I think that it just gave me some exercise mostly and some stuff to put on a map. And the problem is that when you're doing stuff with looking at a single person's GPS tracks, basically you're seeing the habits of this person. And this is from when I used to live by Lake Merritt. And basically I walk to the grocery store, I walk to the coffee shop, I walk to the BART station, and that sort of represents my walking life there, which is if you're looking at if you want to find out what my personal patterns are, then it's useful for that. If you want to find out how people in general react to the area, it doesn't help, because there's actually all these people who are walking around the lake for exercise or running or whatever, and that doesn't show up at all here because I wasn't doing that. I was just going to the grocery store. And so then the sort of next thing that I looked to for this was finding out that Flickr had geotagged photos, and that if you collected enough of these, you basically could see what everybody else was up to, or at least everybody who was posting pictures. It's not an enormous sample, but it's dramatically more than anything that I could ever collect myself. And it's also worldwide, so it gives access to places that I had never been, or places that I hadn't been to for a long time. The other thing that is really nice about photos is that people tend to take a lot of them in sequence. You don't have just here's this picture that I took, and then 3 weeks later, here's another picture that I took. People, go from place to place. And when they're posting these things online, they have both locations and times, which means that you can calculate the speeds in between them. And so if you have somebody that, took a picture on this corner, and then 3.5 minutes later took a picture on the next corner, they almost certainly walked between those places because that's, at that distance, at that speed, at that time interval, that's what walking looks like. And so you can reconstruct a fair number of walking paths from this, as well as, getting a whole lot of other stuff that's going on, like, people on these ferries and tour boats that are going to the Statue of Liberty and that kind of thing. But it's also a lot of people walking around. The problem that photos have, though, is that they have this bias toward scenic places. People love taking pictures of water, especially. So, every place that you have a bridge that people can be on, every place where you have a coastline that has something nice on the other side, there's all these pictures that are taken along the shore, and it's not really representative of the total amount of people there. It's got this bias toward, seeing the particularly interesting thing. On one hand, maybe interestingness is actually a quality that you want to record because, at some level, it's not just presence of people, but it's, people who are seeing, who are comfortable, who are happy, who are seeing something that they think their friends will be interested in. That is kind of an interesting thing in itself. But it doesn't necessarily tell you about just, where people are. The next round of this was discovering that if you connect to the Twitter API, you can collect millions of locations every day from geotagged tweets. And the nice thing about these tweets is not just that there's 10 times as many of them as there are photos, but also they seem to be more representative of everyday life. Instead of people just taking pictures of the super scenic places, the highlights of the city, you have a lot of people who are tweeting from home or from school or from stores or whatever. It's a more realistic sample of everyday life. And you can also do things that connect tweets together. It doesn't work the same way that the photos do, where you can just draw a line from one to the next and get paths out of it. But you can sort of you can treat these things as origins and destinations of trips, and you can treat the density network in between as likely paths. And so one of the things that I'm into is generating these things that I ideally want to think of as fantasy subway networks, where basically you're taking all of these trips that were made, and routing them through the densest corridors along there, and you can say, like, this is where there really ought to be a subway line, even though Los Angeles is never actually going to get around to building that subway to the sea probably, and when the pass through the hills is even less likely probably, but yeah, so that's one thing you can do with it. The other thing you can do, just sort of do these general spatial distortions to try to show links between places. I've done a lot of these that I've called wispy maps, that are basically taking the surface and doing a cartogram distortion of it, drawing lines across that cartogram, and then doing the transformation back into real space. And you get the result from that is that you get these sort of curvy lines that either pass through the densest areas or avoid the densest areas, depending on how you're making the cartogram. I'm not sure that these still ultimately end up being very useful for understanding what places are connected to what other places, but it looks cool in the attempt, I think. And the other thing that tweets have is that people talk to other people. You can see who is responding to what other people based on just the at replies in the text, and if you know that, like, where the person who was being replied to was from an earlier tweet of theirs, then you can see what these relationships between places are. So this is just drawing circles between places that people were tweeting from and places that the people that they were replying to were, and you get these links between major world cities and that sort of thing. And tweets also have time, and so that you can make things like this out of it, where this was 2 days worth of tweets during Hurricane Sandy, when a lot of New York City lost power. And the parts that are blue here are basically the places that had power before and didn't have power afterwards, because during normal circumstances there are people tweeting from everywhere, And in a power outage, only the people who have reliable electricity can tweet. So you sort of lose Lower Manhattan here when it was without power. The tricky thing about Twitter, though, is that there's this big question of what do these tweets actually signify? I mean, at some level, they signify that somebody is posting some piece of text that they want other people to read. But there's still some sort of, but the clustering doesn't necessarily have any inherent significance to it. You know, you look at this thing and you can say, you know, here's clearly where a lot of people are, but does that really mean a lot of people there, or does it just mean that, you know, some quirk of the data or quirk of the processing has made these things look more prominent than they really are? So I think ideally you would like to have a bunch of people who are standing on the street in orange vests counting to see, like, you know, what is really going on at these places that have the clusters. You know, so that there's observation on the ground to match this sort of observation from data. And the fortunate thing is that people in orange vests actually do go out on the street and count people because they are traffic engineers and they are trying to understand, you know, what the transportation plans within cities are, and they need to know how many people are using what intersections and what ways to do this. And so this is a map of pedestrian counts in Toronto from a data set that they released in 2012 that basically just counted, you know, for each intersection in the city that had traffic signals, how many vehicles went through during a day, how many pedestrians went through during a day. And, you know, it's the same sort of pattern as the tweets show. You definitely have this downtown cluster, this commercial street cluster. And does it actually match the tweets? Kind of. This is you know, plotting both of those together with the tweets in red, the manual counts in blue. The tweets, you know, in the volume of tweets being adjusted to fit the curve rather than you know, just exactly this many tweets, because it's not like every single person who's passing through there in a day is tweeting from that intersection. It's all an approximation over a long period of time. And it mostly works, but you also see a lot of anomalies in here where, you know, one of the circles is considerably larger than the other at some places. And it sort of particularly falls apart in the really sparse areas for walking, because from the Twitter perspective, you know, a lot of people crossing an intersection on foot is basically indistinguishable from a lot of people tweeting from cars. And, you know, in spite of all the laws against it and stuff like that, there actually are a lot of people tweeting from cars. Hopefully they're passengers rather than drivers. I don't really know. But regardless, major highways do show up well in Twitter as well as really walkable places. So it's not inherently valuable as a source of walkability, just an approximation to it. And this is possible basically in both Toronto and Montreal because both of those cities have been generous enough to actually release all of their count data. They've done it in slightly different ways. Toronto has you know, basically daily counts for pedestrians and vehicles. Montreal has gone into a lot more detail with basically, instead of just the total for the intersection, they're counting each crosswalk separately. They're counting 15-minute intervals rather than all day. But you can still, you know, you can make it comparable between the two of them. The other but if you actually want to see what this looks like in any other cities, it's considerably harder because, you know, most cities have not gone out of their way to release this data set like Toronto and Montreal have. Instead, anything that you can actually get from other cities is basically in the form of environmental impact reports. Which, you know, these lovely enormous binders of every bad thing that could possibly happen as the result of a building being built or something like that, where, you know, consultants have compiled these thousands and thousands and thousands of pages, you know, some of which contain how many people were using these intersections. And so the great challenge of this is, first of all, finding all of these things online and then turning the reports back into data. Because you know, the way that they're distributed is not actually usable. They're not, you know, unlike the you know, the census data is meant to be used. This is meant to be sort of looked at and trusted that it you know, that they thought of everything. But it's not, you know, it's not set up in a way that you can actually use it directly yourself. This is 3 examples of the kind of things that end up in environmental impact reports. Probably the most common is this diagram at the top that basically, you know, here's what an intersection looks like. here's how many people went each direction at it. And these are typically for the busiest hour of each day. The unfortunate thing is that these diagrams are actually pretty useless for anything other than hand transcribing the data, because there's so much variation in the format of it that trying to do any kind of automated extraction is basically just an exercise in futility. Things that look like spreadsheets are a whole lot more practical. They're still PDFs, and it means that you're still, doing all the work to extract text out of PDFs rather than just having a nice spreadsheet that you can start with. But they have a fairly regular format. They have this, they have a regular number of columns. They have labels on them. If you pull the text out of the PDF, then you can figure out what's going on from these things. There's still some variation from city to city. The one on the left is from Los Angeles, which their format is basically that they look at 6 hours during the day. They look at each intersection leg. They count children and adults separately, which is kind of interesting because apparently, I don't know whether this is actually true, but apparently at least they have the belief that a lot of these intersections, that the pedestrian traffic is dominated by kids walking to school rather than adults. The one on the right is from Washington, D.C., which, instead of doing hourly totals, they're doing 15-minute intervals. They're counting all pedestrians together regardless of age. Both of these kind of do weird things with bicycles that are not terribly useful. For instance, the Los Angeles one is counting bikes, but it's basically, for the 6 hour total. And again, I guess Washington D.C. also basically does the same thing where they have, maybe this one doesn't actually have a bicycle count on it. Some of them do, but it's not counted by intersection leg. It's not counted by time interval. It's just here's the total. So we've got a whole lot more numbers after doing a ton of scraping of websites to get these environmental impact reports. And I've basically at this point collected, I think, 28,000 locations, which, in the grand scheme of things, compared to the number of tweets in a day, it's a tiny number. But it may actually be more representative of reality in some way. And so there is the question, if we have enough of these manual counts, do we really need the tweets to figure out what's going on, or can we just use actual human counted numbers? This in particular is a map in Los Angeles with and you can clearly see where the peaks of walkability are. You've got the downtown on the right, you've got University on the left, you've got Hollywood and Highland on the top, and these are the places where people are walking. Los Angeles has this reputation as not being a walkable city, but there actually is an awful lot of walking going on there if you look for it. So what kind of stuff can you make out of these numbers? The first thing that I thought to do was just to collect street view images for them and average those images together. And this is taking basically 50 intersections with the least walking and the 50 intersections with the most walking. And you can sort of get a sense of, what, even though it's just kind of a blur, what the conditions of these things are. If there's no walking, you've basically got this sort of expanse with, just kind of, very low stuff on the horizon. If there's a lot of walking, then there's also buildings and other stuff. It's a very tall, enclosed kind of space. But rather than looking at averages, it may actually be more useful to look at, details. And these are kind of the extremes of what I was able to find in North America. On the left-hand side, you have an intersection in North Carolina that is basically crossed by one person a day. And on the right, you have an intersection in Toronto that's crossed by 11,000 people an hour. And the kind of interesting thing about these counts, I didn't know, if there was necessarily going to be a interesting distribution to them. But basically, if you take the logs of the count and plot how many of each there are, it comes out as this very nice bell curve. And sort of the peak of the bell is 38 people per hour. This is another picture from North Carolina and North Carolina did a nice job of including pictures of all the intersections they were counting too. This is an intersection that is kind of, I think, typifies the the North American walking experience, which is basically you've got 38 people an hour crossing the street, which basically means that if you are there, you are the person who is there. There is you are alone in the world. However, 1.5 minutes later, there's going to be somebody else. So you're not really alone in the world. You just can't actually see that you're not alone in the world. If you look at the bell curve for Los Angeles, the bell is a little, the peak is a little further to the right. The peak in Los Angeles is the most common thing in Los Angeles is 53 people per hour crossing this intersection. And so in that kind of circumstance, you basically got a 50% chance that there's somebody else there with you. It's still not a crowd, but you know that you are not alone in the world. And what this 53 people per hour looks like in different cities actually varies a lot. In Kansas City on the top, 53 people per hour is actually, an example of a pretty lively place. Here's a theater with like people camping out for tickets on the right-hand side. This is what gets you 53 people per hour in Kansas City. On the bottom, Vancouver is on the other end of the scale. 53 people per hour there is like, this kind of sprawly, far from the center kind of intersection that, still manages to get these numbers that look good in Kansas City. So how many people do you actually want at an intersection? I had sort of, for a long time been going naively with the belief that more was better, that, the spots on the map that had lots of stuff going on were inherently better than the places that didn't. But there probably actually is an upper bound to what's reasonable. This is the famous crossing in Japan that gets 150,000 people per hour, which is just an enormous mob. And there actually is there's been a lot of studies of crowding. Crowding is something that people know how to analyze, basically because, when you're in a theater like this or when you're in a crowded station or something, you need to know how many people you can get out the exits in a given amount of time. You need to know how much space to allocate for staircases, for corridors, and stuff like that. So the Highway Capacity Manual has this set of formulas in it that basically rank different densities of people by what they call level of service. And level of service A is where you have, for an intersection an intersection that has traffic lights, where you've got 49 square meters to yourself. Nobody else is interfering with your walking at all. And then on at the bottom right there is level of service F, where there's more than one person in the same meter as you, and you basically can't go anywhere. It's a little bit hard to translate these things into intersection counts, because they're thinking about it in terms of people per meter of width. And so there's a whole big assumption that you have to make about how wide your crosswalk is. But it more or less works out to, an upper bound of maybe 1,500 people an hour that they think is comfortable, and beyond that you're getting crowded. It's a lot harder to find a number for the lower bound. The only systematic study that I've ever actually been able to find on this is a paper that Richard Underman and Anne Moudon wrote about commercial districts in Seattle, and basically they made the assertion that you want 380 people on a street, which I'm translating this into intersection counts because that's the numbers that I have available to me. Which means 760 people crossing the street per hour. And they've looked at some commercial streets and decided that that's what they think is comfortable. They said 150 people on a street is definitely not. You feel lonely and alone then. And my personal belief is that they're about right. When I was sort of out there standing on the street counting people myself, I decided that 800 people per hour is basically what feels comfortable to me. And I think that a large part of what makes it feel comfortable is illustrated in this picture here, where basically you have a crowd of people and a car trying to turn, and there's enough people in the crosswalk that the car can't turn until they've all gone. And there's kind of a fundamental trade-off here, where at some level you need transportation, and at some level you need transportation not to interfere with the people who are there. There's another thing that looks like a nice bell curve that is basically the trade-off between turning volume and pedestrian volume. And sort of up to 450 turning cars per hour, more cars means more people, presumably because those first of all, the cars are going to places that, are useful places to be. They're probably even dropping off some people who will then cross the street. And then beyond 450 turns per hour, it starts to fall off again. And I think that because that's the point where, the cars are filling the intersection and the pedestrians are waiting instead. So that's kind of an important peak to know. The other thing that kind of throws this all off is that there are streets that actually feel comfortable with a whole lot less people than that. This is a row house street in Washington, D.C. that, I really enjoyed being on. I looked up the numbers afterwards, and there's 150 people crossing the street per hour there. And so at some level, residential streets that look like this are just fine with that volume. And I'm not sure why, but it sort of points to the fact that, there is not a single standard. There is a range of things that make sense in different contexts, and somehow we need to figure out what these different contexts actually call for. And so then the last part of this is, how do we actually achieve these numbers? There's been tons and tons of work done trying to figure out what levels of housing density, what levels of design, what types of design actually lead to walkable places. And at some level, density and design are just not enough, because you can have a street like this that has tall, nicely designed buildings, and there's still nobody there. So what's going on? I think that the basic thing that is going on is just based on the time that people have to spend. Because fundamentally our lives are mostly not about walking around. We are not devoting our lives to filling crosswalks for the benefit of other people. We are doing things that are useful to us. And so, if you look at I can't remember exactly somebody did a pedometer study of Americans and determined that people in the US walk about 10 minutes a day, which means that you're walking about half a mile, you're crossing about 6 or 7 streets. And so your own individual contribution to that peak hour crossing is basically, 0.6 or 0.7 crossings. If you're doing this all where you live. And so, does this street in Rockridge have, 1,333 residents? Does this block in Washington, D.C. have 250 residents? I don't think it does. I think these are both, considerably less populated than you would expect from the pedestrian counts. And the thing that's going on is that people don't actually radiate out uniformly from their homes. They are not, just going out. They are going places that are useful to them. And so you have kind of two kinds of things going on here. There's micro concentration within your neighborhood, where basically, you are much more likely to go in the direction of where the stores are, where the transit is, that kind of thing. And so, your contribution to the total walking of the neighborhood is basically, being pushed in one direction, taken out of another. And then on the other hand, you have macro concentration on a city level. And this is basically where transportation comes into it. That there are tons and tons of people who basically do no walking at all at home. They basically, or maybe they walk a block to the subway station or something like that, but they're probably driving to their workplace or they're driving to the store, and all the walking that they do is actually at the workplace or the store. And so you get these gigantic concentrations in some places that basically pull the life out of other places to make it happen. And I think at some fundamental level, this has to happen, just because the level of population that's required to actually create pedestrian density that is enough to keep stores alive, for instance, is just far beyond what almost any city can manage. Jane Jacobs famously said that 100 units per acre is enough. And if you look at what 100 units per acre looks like, that's actually really tall buildings. And most cities just can't realistically have really tall buildings everywhere. Transportation has to play a part in it. So I wish I actually had been able to quantify what part transportation plays in it, but I didn't get to that part. So maybe next year. I would still love to talk to anybody that has anything that they'd like to say or ask about any of these things. Thank you all.
And demonstrate digital gaps with age or race.
Okay, so as far as open paths, I haven't used that data directly. That's a volunteer GPS repository, right? And I've looked at the OpenStreetMap GPS repository, and the trouble there is that it has the same kind of biases as my own GPS tracks do. You basically have people who are intentionally exploring, or you have people who are doing the same thing over and over again. It's a very skewed sample, so it doesn't actually really represent the total of what's going on at the street. It represents what somebody has decided to upload. And as far as the demographics of Twitter goes, the biggest gap that it shows is basically that it's very skewed by age. Twitter skews young, and so like a street that has like a retirement home on it or something like that, can have a whole lot of people and basically totally unrepresented on Twitter. This is a problem. The other demographic categories are actually a little bit better. Twitter has, for whatever reason, the advantage of having a much larger Black community than most online services. So it's actually much more racially representative in the U.S. than most of these things. And it actually is very gender representative too. For a while, it skewed male. But the geotag tweets have actually, at least based on the names that people are using, which isn't necessarily the truth, but at least is indicative of going on. It's actually skewed a little bit female for a while, which is nice. A nice thing to have too. I don't know if that answered. Thanks. Yes.
Thanks. I wonder if you could comment about a couple possible approaches. One pioneered, I think, by Cesar Hidalgo at Media Lab, where basically Mechanical Turk plus Street View to have a large number of people rate, for example, the walkability of randomly sampled locations with enough data to kind of get a metric that you're looking for, which is literally how walkable do you think this is, 1 to 7 or something like this. And another possibility is possibly computer vision of satellite imagery to look for or model, or even do machine learning tricks to compute things that might be walkable.
Absolutely. So I guess the main problem with using Street View is that it's a very car oriented thing. So you're looking at the roadway rather than at the sidewalk. So it's kind of missing a lot of the aspects there. That said, there was actually a book that I read recently called Measuring Urban Design that actually did do a systematic study of Street View images. First of all, to count how many people were in each of the Street View images, and then to look at the other characteristics of the street that you could see. And they came up with a model that they think predicts pedestrian volumes in New York City based on that. I'm not sure how good it really is because, all these models have tons of noise in it, but people are definitely trying. The thing about aerial imagery is, well, first of all, you've also got kind of a level of detail problem that, there's only so far you can zoom, but trees are actually a big problem too, because trees are one of these things that are correlated with walkability. People like to be around trees, but they also totally obscure what's going on from the air. So it really sort of throws off your attempts to collect data that way. Yeah, definitely, and there's a huge correlation between retail and walkability. Retail areas have tons more people than residential, this is kind of the I guess one of the things that I'm trying to do with this, because retail is gets so much more walkability, that means that retail kind of gets overbuilt. Because you've got all of these places that are trying to attract people, and therefore you must put a storefront in every building, and most of those storefronts are going unfilled because there just isn't that much demand for commercial space, or because the demand for the commercial space is not in the same place that this building is, and so that's why I think that the concentration stuff is actually important, because it's sort of highlighting that not only must the retail exist, but it must exist in corridors that make sense. And yes, as far as other land use data goes, I totally agree that this stuff is very important, and I need to figure out the correlations. This is another thing where data availability is a big problem, because some cities have good online zoning maps, or especially if they have it in shapefile format. A lot of places don't. So it's the matter of trying to find places that both have good pedestrian data and have good land use data at the same time, and they often don't overlap. Anyone else? Yes.
Hi. Yeah, I was just wondering about sort of cultural or regional relativism in the sense of comfort for pedestrian flow. Do you have the information about, like, when you said, you showed that image of Tokyo and it was like, there's sometimes it's too much, but is that, maybe that's what residents of Tokyo are comfortable with? And do you have a sense of, in doing these surveys, whether somebody said, maybe there's a way you can analyze the gap between what people think is appropriate regionally and what actually is happening on
The only systematic study I know about regional variations in comfort is that the highway capacity manual level of service calculation specifically cited another study that was done in Thailand, which apparently has much greater tolerance for crowding than the New York study that provided the U.S. data did. So there's definitely some kind of regional variation in acceptability, but I don't know what it is. Yes?
I'm curious if there are already efforts underway to create standards around, data for walkability, bikeability, things of that sort. Yesterday, one of the conversations led to talking about how Google has a standard for transit data and that sort of thing. So is that sort of thing underway? Are you pioneering? Is it something that we can do to help?
There is a standard that the Federal Highway Administration, I think, is responsible for pedestrian counts. And I have never actually seen that file format used in the wild, because otherwise it would be a really valuable thing to have a standardized format. But I think that they are trying to assert this and that it's just not being used at all. For the things that I've been gathering, I've basically copied Montreal's file format, which is basically just a CSV that has rows or columns for rows for times, columns for each intersection leg, and just has numbers in there. You could complain about the format; it's not the greatest thing in the world, but it's really useful to have a standard for comparing between places. And I'd love to have an even better standard that people were actually using.
Thank you. Just how do you think about seasonality and the role of winter and summer? And I'm sure Minneapolis is much nicer right now than other times.
Yeah, and this is another thing where data availability is a big problem, because for all of these sort of systematic counts, they tend to do them in the summer because they don't want to have it affected by snow and that kind of thing, which means that it's all skewed toward the sort of warm weather kind of things. The only thing that I've really tried to look at that in is the effect of sunlight on. Because there's sort of this concept that people would rather be on the north side of the street because that's where the sun is shining on, and that the south side is relatively underused. And there is a tiny little bit of skew that maybe makes it look like northern cities would rather have people on the north side of the street, and that Los Angeles they'd rather be on the south. But it's such a tiny effect that it's very hard to say if it actually means anything.
I've been following your work for years, and it seems to me that you are driven by obsessions.
Yeah, you could say that, I guess.
And I wonder, yesterday, Nicolas Felton talked about what would be his end goal in terms of data arriving to the level of capturing conversations, and then he will totally stop, right? What's your goal in your case, if you have one?
Well, I mean, as far as pedestrian activity, the end goal is how comfortable are people in different circumstances, and I'm sort of using volume as a proxy for popularity, because places that nobody likes are places that they won't go to very much. Places that they really like are places that they will go a lot. But at the same time, this is. Is it actually representative? So I mean, if I actually could have, I think that the realistic data collection is not how do people feel, because I don't think anybody knows how to do a sensor for how people feel. You can sort of do a little bit of this, measure excitement levels kind of thing, but different kinds of excitement are different kind of quality of experience. So I really think that. What would be really valuable is, for computer vision technology to get to the point, or not even necessarily computer vision, but to get either computer vision or some other kind of sensing technology to a point where pedestrian counts are not this rare thing that's done, maybe once every 10 years for an intersection or something like that, where it's actually, something closer to, what's going on today. I don't know. Everything's an approximation to reality. The other thing that's totally missing is the the origin destination side of it. There have been some very small scale studies of where are people who are walking to a particular store coming from, but that really doesn't tell you very much about the grand scale, like who is everybody on the street and why are they there. And at the same time, you don't want to be creepy about it either. Like there's knowing too much about why people are there is invasive, and I don't want to be that guy either. Yes.
Maybe this is just that question of what the definition of walkability is, but in your mind, do people walking on a street, does that naturally follow from a walkable street? Are they tied together in that way, or could you have a highly walkable area that nobody actually utilizes?
Right, and this is my problem with these sort of design metrics for walkability, is that you can build a street that does all of the formal things right, as good as you possibly could do it, but it's not in a useful location, so there's nobody there. And so, a street that is nominally walkable but isn't used is not a success in my mind. And this is kind of a problem that some of the I think the new urbanists are sort of wrestling with, is that they understand a lot of the design parameters. They know how to build, but they don't necessarily know how to have the context that makes people actually be there. Anyone else? Thank you all for listening.